In this session, we're going to talk about a patented technology we have here at Nerdio called Hybrid Active Directory. This is a unique technology at Nerdio that integrates Windows Server Active Directory and Azure Active Directory. This is super popular for MSPs who are managing hybrid environments on behalf of their customers. We'll look at how this works in a comprehensive and step-by-step way. Enjoy the session.
Okay, today we're going to return to everyone's favorite topic and delve into it in under the hood a little bit, and that is Hybrid Active Directory. We're going to take a look at what it all looks like from a Windows perspective. There was a request for that type of a session a few weeks ago, and hopefully this is going to be it. We have an environment in dev, account 5002, which has Hybrid AD enabled. I'm going to give everyone a quick reminder of what all the pieces are, and then we'll log into the Windows environment as a domain administrator and going to go through the various pieces of what NAP is automating. All right, so let's pull up our little article here that walks you through everything step by step. So as you recall, in order to set up Hybrid AD, the first thing to do is set up a VPN. So let's see what that looks like in this environment. We're going to go under Network, VPN Connections, and take a look at what's going on with the network. All right, so we have two VPN tunnels. This is the one that is set up for Hybrid AD. You could see the local network is 1098.1.0. and it is currently connected, which is great. That's our first prerequisite. The second thing is setting up a domain trust. You'll recall that happens under the onboard domain section. We come in here, click add domain trust. We get prompted for a domain controller IP address and login credentials. Once we type those login credentials in, it gives us a list of available domains on that particular domain controller. We select that domain. It goes ahead and creates a server, a VM in the Azure environment. We called it EADDC09 in this case. You can see it was labeled as the external domain controller, and it is part of that external domain. And here is its IP address. So now you can see there's a DC01, which is controlling the Nerdio domain. It's been renamed here through the white label functionality. And then there is an external domain controller here that is now a member of the external domain. And then there is a domain trust between the two. Let's see if we can now log into it. I'm modifying a user to make a change. So we'll wait a couple more minutes for that to complete. Okay, so then once, you'll recall, once we set up that domain trust, the next step is making the domain NAP managed. And by doing that, it is going to create an OU structure and various GPOs and things like that. And that is done from this screen again right here by set as NAP managed. There's a button here. It's already done in this particular case. One of the things, or the one thing you have to specify when you are setting up a domain as NAP managed is where AD Connect is running. Just a reminder that if you choose this option, it's going to put it on the domain controller that was created, but it's not going to install the AD Connect. It's basically going to assume that you've already done what's needed to be done in order to configure AD Connect in this particular case. Okay, and then once all of that is done, we are in this particular state where it says the domain name, IP address of the domain controller, the fact that it's NAP managed, and we have this button that says import users. If you click import users, what it's doing right now is enumerating all of the user accounts on the external domain, giving them to you in a list. We'll be able to do multiple selections here and then click import. And by clicking import, we are going to move that user object from whatever OU it happens to be in right now to the new newly created users and groups OU. So here are all the users. It shows you what the username is. You can filter this user list because it can get pretty long. You can filter it by typing in a name right here. And also important to note is that any users that have this red icon, that means it's disabled. Anyone who doesn't is enabled. So in this case, let's take an RDS user, click import, and it gives you that warning that will move the user from the current OU to users and groups active users OU, and your relevant GPO policies will need to be reapplied. Okay, so we can start that process and see what happens. This is still running. Okay, it's syncing with Azure now, so I'm sure that user is already a domain admin. So let's log into the environment as Andy. All right, so we are on a desktop within the environment. I'm going to open up a few different windows here. So first thing, what's with the resolution? First thing is I'm going to go to DCO1, and I'm going to log in as Nerdio administrator. Oh, no, it's not Nerdio. I think it was. And let's try this. Okay, good. So we have a domain, DCO1 coming up. And then we're also going to log in to the external domain controller. If we type in its name, remember it's EAD DCO1. Oh, I'm sorry, DC09. I don't know why that looks so small. So what is the name of it? Okay, DCO9. Now, if we just use the name without the domain, it's not going to work. So we need to do dot external dot domain dot local. So let's do that. Dot external dot domain external dot domain dot local. And here we're going to do and the name of that domain is going to be Nerdio administrator at external.domain.local. So we have two domain controllers that are now open. We have the EAD DCO1, and then we have DCO1 itself. So I'm going to close anything that was being done here for now. And let's take a look around, first of all, in DCO1. And where I want to start is if we go back to this article and go through the list of the things that change when you create a domain. So it tells you what the process is. So the process is set up a site-to-site VPN. We'll look at that, verify the functional level, make sure DNS is reachable, etc. Create a new VM. You saw us, we created that VM. We're logged into it right now. Okay, then it's going to create a new OU called users and groups. So if we go into our external domain right here, and we open up users and groups, or users and computers. Let's also open up domains and trusts, and also open up sites and services. So, okay, so we are going step by step here. So domain, users and computers. So if we look in users and computers, this is a little bit further along the process, but we see this OU that was created, users and groups. Remember, this is the external domain. So imagine this is the customer's existing domain, not a Nerdio. So this OU didn't exist. It just got created. It didn't have any of this content with the exception of this Nerdio administrator user that was added. Okay, so it creates that. It creates a Nerdio administrator user and places it into that OU. And then it does some DNS stuff. So it does two things. Adds a conditional forwarder for the Nerdio domain to the other DNS server, and adds a conditional forwarder to the external domain controller DNS to Nerdio. So here's what I mean by that. So let's look at the DNS server on the external domain controller. what you'll see is if we go here and if we go into conditional forwarders, we have the Nerdio domain. Again, it's white labeled, so the name is different. The Nerdio domain is listed here. And if you click on it, it has the IP address of DCO1, which is a domain controller and DNS server for this particular reason, of this domain. So what does that mean? That means that if I go to and I type in dco1.samar.int and I try to resolve it, it's actually going to resolve it. How does it do that? It sees that this is the domain I'm trying to look up. It knows that I have a conditional forwarder to that domain. It forwards the DNS lookup request to this IP address, and that IP address DNS server returns that. So it's the same thing if I do ns lookup fsl1.samar.int, you'll see that we got a reply on that IP address. Conversely, if we go into DCO1 and we look at DNS there, we'll see the reverse. We'll see conditional forwarder for the external domain and the IP address of the existing domain controller, which is where we started, plus the IP address of of the EAD DCO9. So now you have two DNS servers that can reply to this query. And this way, if we type in nslookup EAD DCO9 dot external domain local, okay, we also get a resolution, and the way that resolution arrives is through these forwarders. So the next thing that happens is we join EAD DCO1 to the external domain, which is already done. We install it as a domain controller, so we add the role and the domain controller role and the DNS role. You've seen that already happened. We then create an AD replication subnet. So let's see how that works. So if we go into EAD and we open up sites and services, so if we look under sites, there's going to be the default site, which is going to contain the original server. Okay, so the on-prem server. So these are the two domain controllers, one of which is the IP address that we connected to. So I bet if we go, we type in ping on-prem DCO1, okay, that's the one that we connected to originally to establish the trust. So you see, this is the default site. That's basically what was in place before Nerdio came in and did anything. We then create another site, call it Nerdio. We place the newly created domain controller, which is in Azure, right? So Nerdio is in Azure, and this domain controller is in Azure. And then we also have a subnet that gets created. So this is the original subnet that's tied to this site. This is the newly created subnet, which is now tied to this site. Why is this important? This is important for authentication. So if you have a device that is sitting in this site, which is in Azure, or in this site, which is on-prem, and it tries to authenticate with the domain, Active Directory based on this configuration will tell it, hey, you're coming from this subnet. That means you need to authenticate with the domain controller in your site. Whereas if somebody has a machine in this location, right, in the default for site name, then they're coming from this IP address, and Active Directory tells them that you need to authenticate with one of these domain controllers. Okay, so that is why these sites and subnets are created during this process. Okay, so we created the replication subnet and a site called Nerdio, and then finally we create a two-way domain trust between the two domains. So let's take a look at that. So if we go into EAD DCO1, we open up our sites and services, or I'm sorry, domains and trusts, and we right-click on it and we go to properties and we look at trusts. What you'll see is now this domain, external.domain.local, now trusts samar.int and is also trusted by samar.int. You can see that it's a forest level trust. It's kind of the most complete. and it's also transitive. So that means if somebody else trusts one of these domains, then it will be transitive. Then you can click on properties, and there are a few other things that are important under properties. There's this name suffix routing. These are the various UPNs. So by having this enabled like that, allows someone who is, let's say, in the external domain to authenticate through, let's say, the ADFS infrastructure that is sitting in the other domain. So it basically lets you not only use usernames that have at external.domain.local and at external at samar.int, but also any of these suffixes basically become routable between the two domains. So doing all this basically makes the two domains very tightly connected to each other, so you can share resources between them. Then we go on to the next step. The next step is clicking that Set as Managed button. Remember, then you get to select where your AD Connect is running. In our example, you saw that we selected that the AD Connect is running on the server, the external domain controller right there. So what does that actually do? That will first validate that it can reach AD Connect and can run PowerShell commands. And it just tells you it needs to be installed, so that validates it. Okay, then it adds this as a conditional forwarder for that zone. So actually this gets, I showed you both directions, but the second part of it on DCO1 or on the other domain controller, sorry, for DCO1 is only done at this step. The reason it already exists is because we already passed this step here. And then this conditional forwarder there as well. Then we have the Nerdio administrator gets added to the domain admins and administrators built-in group. So let's verify that that's actually happening. So if we go to this domain controller and we look at our domain, we find this account and we see what it is a member of. Okay, so this, and this was added by the process. Then we also add DCO1 to the built-in terminal server licensing servers group. This allows users from the external domain to use the RDS license server role, which is running on DCO1, which is in the Nerdio domain. Okay, so if we look at built-in objects, there's an object called, this is a default, it exists in all environments, called terminal server license servers. And in order for users from this external domain to be able to get a license when they log into RDS from a server that's not in their domain, we needed to add DCO1, as you'll see in a second, into this group. And you can see it's DCO1 from that domain that's now authorized to be a license server for this external domain. Okay. The next thing that happens is enabling of the suffixes for UPN routing. I showed that to you a minute ago. We then create an organized sub-OU structure inside of the users and groups. So as I mentioned, when it first starts out, this OU structure has only this user account. Now you can see it has all the other familiar groups. It has active users, archive users, contacts, distribution list, security groups, etc. So that gets created at this step. Then the next thing we do is we link GPOs from the Nerdio domain to this particular OU. Let's see how that looks. So if we open up group policy, okay, so if we open up group policy and we browse to our users and groups OU, there it is, and we see what's linked to it. So you see here are all the policy objects that are linked to it, and you can see that they're actually not local policy objects. They're policy objects that are coming from the other domain. So if you make a change in Nerdio, this same change will apply to users in the external domain. So we've linked all of these things like in Office 2016 configuration, folder redirection, IE settings, etc. There is a little bit of a trick on this particular one that George worked out, where we basically only apply this folder redirection policy to users who are enabled for RDS or VDI and who are logging in to an RDS session host in Nerdio. Okay, why is that important? Because if you look by default, all the other policies are open to authenticated users, which means anybody who's a domain user who logs in with an account that's within the scope of this group. So imagine you take a user who's a current local user and you want to give them a desktop in Nerdio. So they get moved into this OU. Now this policy applies to them. The next time they log in, whatever this policy dictates is going to apply to that user. Now the problem is with folder redirection, it's a user policy, but it will take their desktop and document folders and point them at FSO1, which is in Azure. So even if they're logging into their local desktop, they're logging into the local desktop due to the fact that their user account object was moved in here, and there is a policy that applies here, they will have their local desktop's documents folder and desktop folder redirected, if not for the fact that we have this permission set here. What does this do? This basically says not only do you have to be, so instead of being an authenticated user, which is everybody, you have to be a user that has a desktop, and you have to be logging into a computer which is in Nerdio in this group, right? So no local computers from the external domain will be part of this group. So when they log in locally, this policy will not apply and it will not redirect their folders. When they log into a resource, an RDS session host or a VDI machine that is in Nerdio, it's going to be a member of this group and the policy will apply. So then the next thing is this IT department group. So if we look at here and we look under security groups, we now have three new groups. One is called Nerdio RDS users, Nerdio VDI users, and the IT department group. If we look on the DCO1, you'll notice something similar. So if we look under security groups, oops. Okay, so we'll have VDI users, RDS users, and the IT department group, plus all the other groups. Now, in the other domain, they don't have to be in this particular OU because they haven't been imported, so to speak. But these two groups are important because that's what entitles people to use the RD gateway and the RDS infrastructure. So if you look at the membership here, you'll notice, or I should say member, I guess I can't see it from here. So anyway, one thing I want to point out first about the IT department group. The IT department group exists in both domains. There's an IT department in Nerdio, and there's also an IT department group in the external domain. And then the IT department is what enables a member to become a local admin on their machine. Okay, so that group gets created. And then in this interface, when you're managing users, as you add users to the various domains, you'll notice that there are two IT department groups. One is within that domain, and this user is not that domain. Sorry, I'm getting myself confused here. See if we have any users in the external domain. We should, because I imported one. Remember, I imported RDS user one. Here it is. Let's click here. Okay, and now you can see that there's an IT department group from that domain listed right here. So you'll notice that now when hybrid AD is enabled, you have the Active Directory domain listed next to the object name or next to the group name. So when you go into groups, you can see groups from both locations. So let's see what that looks like. Okay, so now we have groups that are that domain, and you also have groups that are So here is this IT department group I talked about. It exists, one exists in each domain. Okay, let's see the remaining steps. Okay, so then there are some additional groups in AD that allow the same thing we did with DC01 for licensing purposes, same thing we got to do with RD Gateway for gateway routing purposes. We also create this RDS users and then add that into that OU. Members of these groups will be able to access RDS resources, and then we take this group and this group, and we add them to this policy in the RD gateway, which again allows users from the other domain to come through the RD gateway, which is in the Nerdio domain. So you don't have to create a separate RD gateway. You can use the one that already exists. Then we add OU to the AD Connect sync list. Now, this is not an automated process. This is something that the administrator has to do. AD Connect is not really configurable programmatically very well. And especially if this is an AD Connect that's already synchronizing an existing environment, we don't want to make changes. So what we tell the user is, hey, we just added a new OU into your Active Directory. This OU, you're going to be putting user objects into. If this happens to not be in scope of your synchronization, it's going to see those users as deleted and is going to soft delete them in Office 365, which is not what you want. So you want to make sure that the administrator goes in to the existing AD Connect configuration and they edit this users and they edit the scope to include users and groups. So let me show you what that looks like. So if we go here, just gonna again show it to you as an example. Let's go to this local domain and we go to, I think here. Okay, so this is what the container selector looks like. So if you have it selected like this, it's basically backing everything up. So especially if you just do this kind of a selection, any new OU that get added will be selected. But imagine, the environment looks like this. You're syncing this, and you're syncing this, and you're syncing this, right? And you're not really syncing everything else. So when a new OU is created, it's going to be in this kind of state. It's going to be unchecked. So this is why administrator has to go in and check it so that when you move users from here to here through the import process, they don't get removed from Office 365. So that's what this step is all about. You have to go in and just check that box in AD Connect configuration. And then finally, the next step is user import. You saw me do it with this RDS user, right? So all I did is I went under onboard domains, click import users. It gave me a list. I highlighted it and clicked import. It didn't reset the password. It didn't do anything to the user account other than move it from the OU that it was into the active users OU under users and groups. You can see the user is still in this domain. The users would still have his existing Office 365. You can now come in here and you can assign a desktop to that user. Okay, you can assign a desktop to that user. And if we go under the configuration here, on the external domain controller, you'll notice that this is the list of users that we saw before, right? We had RDS user 1, 2, and 3. We had VDI users 1, 2, and 3. We selected RDS user 1 and clicked import. And all that did is it moved that user from there to here, right? That's literally the only change that was made. So after it did that, it did a refresh of the NAP user cache list. It read all the objects in this folder structure, this OU structure. It noticed that there's a new user, and it displays that user in the Nerdio users list right here. So what that means, if we were to go into this screen, watch this, and we take another user. So let's take VDI 01 or VDI user 1 and move it right here. Okay, and say yes. So it's gone from there, and now it's here. And now we go in here and just hit refresh. Once the refresh is done, we should see the VDI user in this list. Now, if I went ahead and I delete this user, which I can do, that would delete the user from the external domain, right? This is where it exists. It exists in the external domain. So it's really important to understand that this is not a copy of the user. This is not, some proxy for it. This is the actual user object that exists in the existing domain, in the external domain, and is just visible through the NAP. So anything you do to it is going to be done on the domain itself, on the external domain itself. So it's really important to keep that in mind and not accidentally, mess with production objects and make changes that are unintended, thinking that these are just copies of those objects. They're the actual objects that are simply moved from one OU to the other. So removing the domain trust, there is no automated way to do it, right? So it has to be analyzed on a case-by-case basis, understanding exactly what the environment, the external environment looks like, what changes have been made, which users have been imported. So it's really important that somebody who wants to break that trust between and the production on-premise domain and the Nerdio domain kind of thinks through what was done. Normally, the process involves removing the domain controller, so removing that from the domain, demoting it from a domain controller, breaking the trust by deleting that trust, moving all the users back to where they belong in terms of their OUs, and only then deprovisioning the Nerdio environment, not before. Okay, let's see if our VDI user is here. Page. And there's a VDI user that we just moved into that OU.